Umayyad history, history of the Umayyad Caliphate. This is season one. Inshallah, this is my first time doing a live recording. Normally, I do these things on my own, so it's a little bit different right now. But inshallah, we'll get things together in just a moment. We'll get into the recording. So just give me a few seconds here to get all set up, and we'll get started, inshallah. And this will be recording live to both Facebook and YouTube, inshallah. And I think we're about ready to go. All right. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to season one of the Umayyad Caliphate, presented by Islamic History Exclusive. I'm your host, Mutaki Ismail, and this is episode 1-10. Before we get into the episode, let's do a brief recap of where we are so far. Muhallab was leading the fight against the Azadika Khawarij in southern Persia. The Azadika had a strong foothold in the Zagros mountains of Persia, and it was difficult for Muhallab to dislodge them. Shabib ibn Yazid and his Khawarij band had run rampant through Iraq for over a year. During this rampage, they attacked Madain in 76 AH and threatened the city again in 77 AH when Mutarrif ibn Mughira ibn Shu'bah was the governor. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf finally defeated Shabib's forces at Kufa, and Shabib died a short time later. And so with that, let's discuss Mutarrif's rebellion. We first discussed Mutarrif back in episode number 7. He was the temporary governor of Madain when Shabib ibn Yazid, the leader of one of the Khawarij bands in Iraq, came down from the mountains with 1,000 men. Mutarrif, who was the son of the companion Mughira ibn Shu'bah, had met with some of Shabib's representatives while the two armies were separated by a river. When it became clear that Mutarrif was not going to join his cause, Shabib left Mutarrif behind and went to face the army from Kufa, which was being led by another man named Attab ibn Warqa. As mentioned, Mutarrif was the son of the companion Mughira ibn Shu'bah. Therefore, he was from the Thaqif tribe, just like Mughira ibn Shu'bah and his boss, basically, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Mughira ibn Shu'bah, as we mentioned in earlier episodes, and most of his family, in fact, were big supporters of the Umayyad clan. However, Mutarrif, the current governor of Madain, had always secretly opposed the Umayyad government. During his brief meeting with the Khawarij band associated with Shabib ibn Yazid, Mutarrif implied that he might be willing to join forces with them against the Umayyad government. Mutarrif suggested that he join with the Khawarij, with Shabib ibn Yazid and his Khawarij, to overthrow the Umayyads, and together they could choose a new caliph through a council similar to the one that Umar ibn Khattab set up just before he died. However, Shabib and the Khawarij rejected this idea, and this is what ultimately led them to break off talks with Mutarrif and go on to Kufa, where he was ultimately defeated by Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, that is Shabib. Shabib was defeated by Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. This led Shabib to cut off talks with Mutarrif and go to Kufa, where Shabib was eventually and inevitably defeated by Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. However, while the two representatives were discussing this potential collaboration with Mutarrif, the other people in Mutarrif's camps heard these negotiations, and they heard him making these suggestions to Shabib's representatives. So Mutarrif's advisors warned him that eventually this was going to get back to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, and he'd be in trouble once the governor found out. Mutarrif acknowledged that they were telling the truth, and he knew he would be punished by Hajjaj, so he decided to take this opportunity to rebel against Hajjaj ibn Yusuf and against the Umayyads, whom he really couldn't stand anyway. So Mutarrif called 3 of his closest military advisors and told them of his plan. Now, they all agreed to support him, but two of his advisors actually slipped out in the middle of the night and returned to Kufa, where they dropped the dime on him to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. So Mutarrif and his remaining supporters, they left Madain and headed for the Zagros Mountains, which lies between, it's really in mostly in Iran, but it lies on the border between Iran and Iraq. Along the way, Mutarrif joined with some of the former supporters of Ibn Zubayr, and they joined him as well, giving Mutarrif roughly a total number of about 300 men. Meanwhile, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf had finally defeated Shabib, and by the time he learned about the rebellion, he was ready to start sending out detachments to catch up with Mutarrif and stop his activities. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf even went so far as to contract an ally with some Kurdish tribes in the Zagros Mountains, hoping to block Mutarrif from escaping through one of its many passes and crevices. But Mutarrif defeated these small Kurdish bands, and eventually he came to Nihavand, which is a town in modern Iran on the western slopes of the Zagros Mountains. From there, he went to meet with his brother Hamza ibn Mughira ibn Shu'bah, who was the governor of Nihavand. Mutarrif's brother Hamza was very upset with Mutarrif's actions, and he disagreed with Mutarrif's rebellion, and he refused to join him, and he refused to grant him refuge inside of Nihavand. But it was still his brother, so Hamza did provide Mutarrif with some money and weapons, which probably didn't work out too well for him later on. Mutarrif left Nihavan and continued to travel east, deeper into Iran, finally stopping at the city of Qom, which is about 70 miles south of Tehran, and then he turned south towards Isfahan. Along the way, he was able to recruit more people, and as a matter of fact, he recruited about 100 men from the city of Ray, which is just south of where modern Tehran is. The Umayyad governor of Isfahan, which is where Mutarrif wound up staying for a while, his name was Bara ibn Qabisa. He wrote to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf explaining the situation. When Hajjaj learned where Mutarrif and his rebels were, he sent orders for his governor of Isfahan, Bara ibn Qabisa, to confront Mutarrif. Bara ibn Qabisa was able to muster an army of about 2,000 men, but word got back to Hajjaj. Word also got back to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf about Mutarrif's brother Hamza and Nihavand. This caused this made Hajjaj worry that Hamza would join up with his brother Mutarrif and making this small rebellion something much more difficult to handle. So Hajjaj ibn Yusuf wrote a letter to the Shurta, that is the police department basically, in Nihavan, ordering them to arrest Hamza and take charge of the city. Basically, not the Shurta itself, but the captain or the leader of the Shurta. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf wrote a letter to him ordering him to arrest Hamza and then take charge of the city. And this was all, of course, to prevent Hamza from joining forces with his brother. When the Shurta came to arrest Hamza, Hamza simply said, Sami'na wa ta'na. We hear and we obey. And he submitted to the governor's orders. So with Hamza out the way, Hajjaj was now able to properly plan for Mutarrif's rebellion. I'm going to pause just briefly. If you are unsure of where we are right now, just want to let you know that the Umayyad Caliphate podcast that we're doing right now, this episode of the Umayyad Caliphate is part of a longer series regarding the Umayyad Caliphate. This is season one of the Umayyad Caliphate. I presume it will probably run for multiple seasons. This is also what I would consider a premium episode. So it is not available to everyone who is subscribed to the Islamic History Podcast. You have to actually subscribe to Islamic History Exclusive. If you're interested in that, if you are on an Apple device, an iPad or iPhone, There is a Islamic History exclusive um, podcast there. Just join there, and you will all, in addition to this one, you also get access to Ibn Zubayr, the story of Ibn Zubayr, and the story of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. If you don't have an Apple device, you can join by either going to Patreon, go to patreon.com/Islamic history, and you can join there. Or you can go to my website, IslamicHistoryExclusive.com, and you can sign up there. Whichever one you do, it's all the same price, roughly $4 a month or $48 a year. It's all about the same. Whichever option you choose, there's really not much difference. So I just want to get that out of the way, and we will continue on with the story. Let me remember where I was first. Okay. And so now, with Hamza out of the way, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was able to properly plan for his attack or his counterattack against Mutarrif's rebellion. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf ordered the governor of Raid to join the army from Isfahan against Mutarrif, and they were also joined by some Kurdish tribes. So altogether, the Umayyad force going after Mutarrif numbered close to 6,000. And as we mentioned before, Mutarrif had at best maybe 400 men. Well, with all of this, Mutarrif finally dug a trench around his forces as the Umayyad armies closed in on him. And this allowed him to resist for a while, and he did put up a good fight. But eventually, the greater numbers of the Umayyads was just too much, and they overwhelmed him. Mutarrif's defenses were overran, and he was killed. The surviving fighters from his rebellion who had joined him, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf pardoned most of them so long as they promised never to rebel again. And that was the end of Mutarrif's rebellion. Sticking in the eastern provinces of the Umayyad Caliphate, we will stay in Persia, but now we will move south to where Muhallab was fighting the Azarika Khawarij. Muhallab was fighting the Azarika Khawarij in southern Persia, and he was having a difficult time with them as the Khawarij were using the mountains to their advantage, and they were really not easy to beat. The Azarika, in fact, had taken control of the city of Kerman in the south central Persia, while Muhallab had Fars in southwestern Persia. But during this long this war against the Azarika Khawarij that Muhallab was fighting, this had been going on since the time of Ibn Zubayr. So it is now a good 3 years since Ibn Zubayr was defeated, and Muhallab is still fighting them. He was first fighting them on behalf of Ibn Zubayr, and now he's fighting them on behalf of the Umayyads. So Muhallab fought the Azadika Khawarij in Kerman. He had managed to cut off all of the supply routes to going to the Khawarij. So he was able to bottle them up in Kerman, and he went into Kerman to fight them. And Kerman is in south central Persia. Muhallab was there for about a year, steadily weakening the Khawarij position. So this was a difficult fight, but the momentum was finally coming onto Muhallab's side. Having learned of the successes that Muhallab was having in southern Persia, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf wanted to appoint a new official to take over the lands of southwestern Persia that Muhallab had left behind. So as Muhallab was pushing the Azadika Khawarij away from southern Persia, he was, of course, leaving a lot of empty, unmanaged, ungoverned lands behind him. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, he wanted to appoint someone there to make sure rebellion didn't start up again. However, word got back to Abdul Malik, who was the Caliph, Amir al-Mu'mineen. When he learned about what Hajjaj was going to do, he overruled Hajjaj's order and insisted that all of these lands that Muhallab had freed were going to remain under his authority, since he was one who had freed them from the Khawarij in the first place. So this shows you why, hopefully I'm going to explain why holding a governor position at this time was very lucrative and very valuable. The governor of any province or any city, anyone who is in charge of a certain region during this period of time, they could charge taxes on the people and the lands under his authority. Now, the taxes that the governor received, of course, some of it had to be used to pay for the army, to pay for the shorta, which is the police force, to pay for the infrastructure, and all other sorts of things like that. But everything that was left over, the governor got to keep that for himself. That became part of his personal wealth. So Hajjaj was once again trying to meddle in the affairs of Persia, and he was trying to get the right person in the right position to try to get some of this money for himself. So, being a governor of in the Muslim Khilafat at this time, it may seem kind of corrupt to us now. I don't know if it was corrupt back then, but it was seen as a very lucrative and beneficial position because the person who held that position, they could make a lot of money. Anyway, Hajjaj decided to meddle in Muhallab's affairs again, and he wrote a letter to Muhallab chastising him for not being more aggressive against the Azadika Khawarij. He accused Muhallab of holding back and not going all out and being as forceful against the Khawarij as he could have been. He accused him of wanting an excuse to stay in Persia and take this land as his own. We'll use this opportunity to read the letter that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf sent to Muhallab. Give me just a moment. I'll have this for you in just a second. As I mentioned, first time doing a live, and so I'm not completely prepared for everything. Okay, here we go. So this is the letter that the message that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf sent to Muhallab, chastising him for not moving fast enough against the Azadika Khawarij. By God, it seems to me that if you really wished to, you could have exterminated these renegade Kharijites by now, but you like your continuing presence, so you may consume the land around you. I have sent you al-Bara ibn Qabisa to rouse you to attack them. Attack them then, when you come Attack them then when he comes to you with all the Muslims and wage the fiercest jihad against them. Let me hear no excuses or petty lies or other such things coming from you. Let me hear no excuses or petty lies or other such things that, coming from you, are distasteful and unacceptable to me. Assalam. So Hajjaj sent the same man we mentioned earlier, Bara ibn Qabisa, with a small force to join Muhallab and make sure that Muhallab was giving this fight his full effort. Well, Bara stayed with Muhallab, fighting alongside him against the Azadika Khawarij, and Bara realized that this was some of the most difficult and taxing and draining fighting he had ever seen. Bara had fought other Khawarij before, but these Azadika Khawarij in Persia were nothing that he had experienced in his life. So he wrote back to Hajjaj stating that Muhallab was actually doing the best he could against a very difficult, strong, and determined opponent. When Hajjaj heard this, he decided to let up on Muhallab and let him continue the battle or continue the war against the Azadika Khawarij as he saw fit. So Muhallab spent the next year and a half fighting the Azadika Khawarij, but eventually the Azadika Khawarij, they destroyed themselves by splitting into factions. The whole story about what happened is that basically the Azadika Khawarij, they argued about how to deal with one of their Khawarij warriors who killed another Khawarij warrior. Both of these warriors, the one who was killed and the one who did the killing, they were both excellent fighters. And of course, they both had their supporters, and one group wanted to execute the killer, but the leader of the Khawarij did not want to execute him because he was such a good fighter and they needed him in their war against Muhallab. And furthermore, as things turned out, the Khawarij warrior who killed his the other Khawarij, the killer that is, turned out to be an Arab as well. And the leader of this Khawarij rebellion, of the Azadika Khawarij, he was also an Arab. And so this dispute within the Azadika Khawarij ran along ethnic lines. They split along ethnic lines. So the Arabs wanted to pardon the warrior who killed the other Khawarij because they needed him. At least their excuse was that they needed him in their battle, in their war against Muhallab. While the other side was mostly Persian, they wanted to kill the killer or execute the killer because that was justice from their perspective. Well, this argument turned into blows, and before long, the Azalika Khawarij had split into two sides, and now they were fighting each other. And this internal war within the Khawarij, within the Azalika Khawarij, went on for about a month. When Hajjaj ibn Yusuf learned of this, he once again tried to meddle in Muhallab's affairs. He ordered Muhallab to attack them while they were distracted. Muhallab got the message and completely ignored Hajjaj's advice and refused to do that because he wanted them to weaken each other. He wanted the Azadika Khawarij to weaken themselves first, so he would have a much easier time fighting against them when he was ready to attack. We're going to read Muhallab's response to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf's order or demand. So Muhallab replied as follows: I have received the Emir's letter and understood everything in it. I do not believe I should fight them now when they are killing one another and reducing each other's numbers. If they keep at this, we will have what we want and they will perish. If they do reunite, they will be doing so only after having exhausted one another, and at that point I will immediately attack them when they are at their weakest and most vulnerable, God willing, inshallah. Assalam. So this fighting within the Azadika Khawarij continued for about a month. Eventually, they went their separate ways. The Arab faction of the Azadika Khawarij headed north towards Tabaristan, which is modern day Alborz province in Iran, right along the Black Sea coast. Once they had done that, Muhallab then moved against the remaining mostly Persian Khawarij in Kerman, and because the numbers had dwindled through both fighting and just splitting apart, Muhallab was able to defeat the Persian faction of the Khawarij completely. With the Persian Khawarij, with the Persian Azadika Khawarij taken out of the picture, Muhallab was ready to move on to the remaining Arab faction of the Azadika Khawarij to the north. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, he of course knew what was going on as well, so he sent an army after the Azadika Khawarij because they were fleeing north while Muhallab was fighting the Persian faction. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf sent an army after the Arab faction of the Azadika Khawarij towards Tabaristan near the Black Sea. And this army that Hajjaj sent after them were mostly Syrian soldiers. And as we mentioned before, the Syrians were generally very good soldiers and very good fighters and much more disciplined than the soldiers that they pulled from the Iraqi cities of Basra and Kufa. Hajjaj also ordered another army of Iraqi soldiers that were already stationed in Tabaristan to join the Syrian army against the Khawarij. So the Arab faction of the Azadika Khawarij, they split into two different divisions, hoping to perhaps spread the Umayyad forces apart, but it didn't really work. One faction or one division of the Azadika Khawarij in the north, they dug a trench and prepared to fight the Umayyad forces in the hills of Tabaristan. The other division took refuge in a castle just south of Tabaristan. But nonetheless, the two Umayyad armies, that is the Kufan army as well as the Syrian army, or perhaps the Iraqi army and the Syrian army combined, they were able to easily defeat the Khawarij forces that were in the hills, and they wound up killing the leader of the Azadika Khawarij. And then the Syrian army headed south and besieged the other division of the Azadika Khawarij in the castle for several days. Eventually, the Khawarij holding up inside of this castle got so hungry they were forced to eat their horses and camels. The commander of the Syrian army, he offered them safe passage if any of the Khawarij would kill their leader and then surrender. However, none of the Azadika Khawarij took that offer. So finally, out of desperation, the nearly starved Khawarij rushed out in a final gust of glory to fight the Umayyads, and they were all killed to a man. So that will end the story of the Azadika Khawarij as well as this episode of the Umayyad Caliphate. In the next episode, inshallah, we will continue to discuss the chaos in the East, particularly focusing on the madness and the disruption that is currently going on in Khorasan. But until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All right, we're going to wrap this up soon, inshallah. I hope you found this interesting. If still have a lot to learn about how this all works, and we'll see how things go, inshallah. But until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.